Can one build a bridge from pure thought to God's existence? This is the third video in a series on that question. They build on this journal article in issue 22 of the Process Studies supplement. The first video gives an overview of that article and St. Anselm's modal ontological argument. The next video defended the modality of necessary existence. This video will defend St. Anselm's idea of God, the pure thought from which the bridge to God's existence will be built. In chapter 2 of his major work, The Proslogion, St. Anselm of Canterbury defined God as that than which a greater cannot be thought. What is the meaning, greater, in the formula? Charles Hartshorne explains it in these terms: X is greater than Y insofar as X is, and Y is not something which is better to be than not to be. Greater thus means superior, more excellent, more worthy of admiration and respect. In short, God is the sole object worthy of worship, of being exalted above all else. We will use the term greatness when referring to that than which a greater cannot be thought. And it is critical that we don't deviate from the formula because this risks changing the meaning. For example, something which is greater than everything, the expression used by Anselm's first critic Gonilo, is simply not the same. As explained by James Cutzinger. The problem, as I hope you can see, is that in Gonilo's formula, unlike Anselm's, God is described in relation to other existent things, and this results in a certain demotion of God, who, for all we know from this substitute formula, is simply at the top of a pyramid of contingent entities. For similar reasons, we will avoid more modern expressions such as greatest conceivable being, most perfect being, and maximally great being. The article concluded that a prima facie case can be made for the intelligibility of greatness. However, serious objections have been raised over the centuries which challenge the conceivability of greatness. Of course, if greatness is inconceivable and lacks meaning, the concept is impossible. The ontological argument then fails before it gets started. Because the modal argument shows that greatness entails necessary existence. One way to attack the conceivability of greatness is to deny the possibility of necessary existence. However, the article and the previous videos make a very strong a priori case for the conceivability of necessity. The article addressed various other objections, and we will examine some of them beginning with the Lost Island parody, which is an indirect way to attack greatness. Anselm's first critic was Gonilo, Anselm's contemporary and fellow monk from Marmoutier. Gonilo wrote a response to Anselm's Proslogion titled Reply on Behalf of the Fool, which contains his famous Lost Island parody. It is helpful to know that Gonilo was attacking Anselm's argument from chapter 2 of the Proslogion, which used a different great-making principle than the modal version from chapter 3, namely that it is greater to exist in the mind and reality than to exist in the mind alone. Gonilo claimed one can conceive of an island that is more excellent or greater than all other lands. Following Anselm's reasoning in chapter 2, one must conclude that such an island exists, for if it did not actually exist, any land existing in reality would be more excellent or greater. In this fashion, one can prove the existence of anything as long as we ascribe to it the attribute of not conceivably having a greater and employ the principle that existing in the mind and reality is greater than existing in the mind alone. Gonilo is making his own reductio ad absurdum argument. His attack on greatness was to show that applying the attribute of not conceivably having a greater to an ordinary object such as an island produces an absurdity. However, if one wants to construct a parallel argument to show the absurdity of the original, then one should be strictly parallel in constructing it, beginning with the subject. In defining God as that than which nothing greater can be thought, Anselm compares the subject to everything possible. It is an attempt to define something absolutely great. If Gonilo's parody is to strictly parallel Anselm's proof, the Lost Island would also need to be compared to everything possible, as in an island than which nothing greater can be thought. But this is patently absurd because an island is, by definition, a bounded and finite entity. At least in physical terms, we can readily think of many things greater than any island, say the entire planet. The only other way to make sense of Gonilo's island would be if its greatness is determined in relation to other objects within the same genus, as in an island than which no greater island can be conceived. Therefore, to be intelligible, Gonilo's Lost Island only defines something that is relatively great, not absolutely great. Because there is no parity between greatness and a lost island, Gonillo's parody loses credibility against Anselm's Chapter 2 argument, which employs the great-making principle that existing in the mind and reality is greater than existing in the mind alone. However, it is quite clear that substituting the lost island for greatness in the modal argument doesn't work. The modal argument is designed to reach the conclusion of the necessary existence of God. By substituting an island or any other finite and contingent thing for greatness, the parody attempts to prove the necessary existence of a contingent thing, which is absurd. Graham Oppy, the preeminent contemporary critic of ontological arguments, claims that all versions can be parodied and that the agnostic has no good reason to choose the original argument over the parody. At least with respect to our 13-step modal argument, he is wrong. One way to object to Gonillo's Lost Island parody comes from philosopher Alvin Plantinga. Plantinga argued that the expression x than which no greater x can be conceived only applies coherently in the case of properties that have a relevant limit. Just as there isn't a greatest possible number, one can always add one, there also is not a greatest possible island. No matter how well endowed an island is with palm trees, beaches, dancing girls, and so on, one can always conceive of a greater island with more palm trees, beaches, and dancing girls. However, Graham Oppy thinks the same applies to greatness. The article explains, if a greatest conceivable island is not coherent, then neither is a greatest conceivable being. As it is with numbers and islands, so it is with being in general. No matter how great is our conception of God, we can always think of something greater, say by adding another universe to its creation. Oppy is suggesting that if Plantinga's objection holds concerning beings conceived in terms of relative greatness, it is equally effective against a being conceived in terms of absolute greatness, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Hartshorne thinks Anselm must concede that for any given thing, even God, a greater can always be thought. However, he comes up a neoclassical solution to the problem by noting an ambiguity in the definition. None greater can be thought can mean no greater individual including God himself, or no greater individual except God himself. The latter meaning allows for God to be surpassable but only by himself. Hartshorne explains that if God is surpassable, even though only by himself, then he can include quantity in his quality, without the quantity being that presumably impossible thing, an unsurpassable quantity. The divine quantity will be surpassable but only by God himself. Now we have none of the contradictions we have been worrying about. God need not be that apparent impossibility, a quality wholly independent of quantity, nor that other impossibility, an unsurpassable quantity. Nor need he actualize all possible value. Yet he can still fully deserve worship by surpassing all conceivable rivals to himself. A classical response to the problem of quantity can be made if Anselm joins forces with Thomas Aquinas and employs the latter's analogy of being. Aquinas argued that our positive talk about God is analogical, and neither univocal or equivocal. A term is univocal when it has exactly one meaning no matter the context. For example, a triangle is always a three-sided figure. A term is equivocal when it has two or more entirely different meanings depending on the context. For example, a bank can mean the side of a river or a financial institution. A term is analogical when it is used in different contexts with meanings that are partly the same and partly different, often by analogy or comparison. For example, healthy, when applied to a person, means physically well. When applied to food, it means promoting health. Aquinas argues that we do not speak of God univocally, because words when applied to God do not have the same meaning as when they are applied to a person. He also argued that we do not speak equivocally about God because there must be some connection of the creature and the Creator. We therefore speak about God analogically. We have this idea of God being unsurpassably great, but this idea is conditioned by our experience with numbers and the relative greatness of creatures. It is true that when we think of numbers we can always add one more, and when we think of created things such as the universe, we can always mentally add one more galaxy. God is certainly great, but God is not great in exactly the same way creatures are great. Greatness, like any other of God's attributes, imperfectly captures God and is only analogically true of God. Inevitably the analogy fails, and this becomes apparent when we push the analogy too far and generate a paradox, such as the problem of quantity as applied to God. The bottom line for Anselm is that the definition of greatness rules out the possibility of something greater. If someone says, I can think of something greater than your concept of God, Anselm would simply reply, then you aren't thinking of that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Anselm could add that this is like saying you can imagine a triangle whose angles don't add up to 180 degrees. You can say the words, but you aren't imagining a Euclidean triangle. It is nonsensical to say I can conceive of something greater than that which nothing greater can be conceived. The only option remaining for the critic is to reject Anselm's definition of God and rest on the dogma that one can always think of something greater than any given thing. The word always admits no exception. So the claim is that it is necessarily the case that for all things, a greater can be thought. This is a metaphysical claim, and we can ponder the irony of skeptics relying on a metaphysical truth to deny that God exists is a metaphysical truth. Oppie also raises the problem of subjectivity. Concerning lost islands and any other being of kind K than which no greater being of kind K can be conceived, judgments about great-making properties seem irreducibly subjective. That is, people can reasonably and irreconcilably disagree about the attributes of, for example, an island than which no greater island can be conceived. It is a big step to suppose that there is a greatly idealized limit in which the conceivings and judgments about conceivability of all reasonable people converge. In response, one can offer the attribute of necessary existence. Why would the judgments of all reasonable people not converge on this great-making property? It seems self-evident that that which exists necessarily is greater than that which exists contingently. In suggesting that great-making properties seem irreducibly subjective, Oppie continues to labor under the assumption that greatness can only be relative and not absolute. In Oppie's terms, God is a being of kind K than which no greater being of kind K can be conceived. Anselm claimed that God is the great exception. Unlike islands or any other created thing, God is God's own kind. Even if judgments about great-making properties of ordinary things are irreducibly subjective, that does not mean judgments about God's attributes must also be irreducibly subjective. Hilary Putnam calls the claim that value judgments are always subjective and relative to the individual the last dogma of empiricism. This dogma holds that it is necessarily true that nothing has inherent value. But this notion is rooted in philosophical relativism, which has been refuted because its foundational claim involves a self-referential absurdity. Finally, we will address something called a reverse modal argument. While it is an attempt to use the argument's own modal logic against itself, it can be understood as making an epistemic claim about greatness and the state of the argument over its conceivability. Graham Oppie claims that modal arguments involving necessity can be paralleled negatively by equally plausible arguments. Assuming our 13-step argument is translatable into a modal form in terms of necessity and possibility, it too may be susceptible to a reverse argument. Here are Oppie's simple positive argument and its negative counterpart. 1. It is possible that it is necessarily the case that God exists. 2. Hence, God exists. 1. It is possible that it is necessarily the case that God does not exist. 2. Hence, God does not exist. In terms of possible worlds, what is true in all possible worlds is necessarily true. What is true in at least one possible world but not in all is contingently true. What is impossible is true in no possible world and thus is necessarily false. What then does it mean to say that God possibly necessarily exists or possibly necessarily does not exist? Holding to Hartran's theory of modality, the possibility under consideration cannot be understood as involving existential contingency. The only contingency is that of conceivability. If God is conceivable, then God exists necessarily and in all possible worlds. If God is inconceivable, then God necessarily does not exist and exists in no possible worlds. Therefore, Oppie's negative argument is really the claim that the concept of God could involve a contradiction, which, if that is the case, means God is inconceivable and God's existence would then be impossible. Therefore, it is an epistemic claim. For all we know, the concept of God could be meaningless. Viewed this way, the reverse argument trades on the fact that objections have been raised which create doubt as to the conceivability of greatness. As with parity arguments, Oppie thinks the agnostic has no good reason to choose between the two arguments. In aid of breaking the tie, consider the following. 1. Because the modal argument shows that greatness entails necessary existence, one way to attack the conceivability of greatness is to deny the possibility of necessary existence. However, the article and the previous video make a very strong a priori case for the conceivability of necessity. 2. Oppie is clearly wrong in thinking that our modal argument is vulnerable to the Lost Island parody. 3. Strong rebuttals to the problems of quantity and subjectivity have been made. We will let you be the judge, but the concept greatness seems pretty resilient to attacks made on it. We will have to end this video here. Thank you for watching.